Okay, we're going to shift gears here now. Oops, excuse me. To talk about, hello, welcome, thank you. To talk about information disorder related to the election. So I should just mention briefly that, I will sit down, mention briefly that the Aspen Institute, the cybersecurity group, the Aspen Cybersecurity group, which you've heard about, does a lot of work streams on different relevant topics. And sometimes those work streams become so large that they spin out into a separate project. And that's what happened with us about, a while ago now, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Yeah. Coming out of the cybersecurity group, we created something called the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder, which brought together a high-level group of experts, two of whom are with us. I'm sure I didn't know you then. You probably would have been with us as well, to create a set of recommendations around the crisis of mis and disinformation. So this is now, we consider this part of, as it should be, part of the broader cyber remit. So just to set this up a little bit, and then I'm going to be quiet because we have three incredible panelists. So as you all know, we had the midterm elections last week, and there was good news and bad news, I would say. The good news is that some of our worst fears about what might happen around mis and disinformation around the midterms didn't materialize, at least not yet. There's still some noise in Arizona and in other places. Trump is raging, but Kari Lake only said that there might have been some possible maladministration. And so, that's actually, compared to some other language we've heard, not so terrible. The bad news, obviously, is the problem has not gone away by a long shot. We have the US presidential election coming up in 2 years. We have elections coming up all over the world, in Poland, UK, Turkey, Spain, host of country, foreign influence operations. What started with the Russians is now a broader playbook, and the platforms certainly haven't cracked the content moderation code. So this is why this is incredibly critical still, and will continue to be even more so to talk about. We have with us Rick Ferguson, Vice President of Security Intelligence at Forescout, also Special Advisor to Europol's European Cyber Crime Center. Next, we have Yasmin Green, who is the CEO of Jigsaw, which is, as you know, a unit within Google that looks at threats to open societies. She leads an interdisciplinary team that researches and develops technical solutions to a range of global security challenges, certainly particularly around mis and disinformation and how that impacts extremism. And probably the man who needs no introduction to this group, but I will introduce him anyway. Chris Krebs, founding partner of the Krebs Stamos group. By the way, we have both Krebs and Stamos in the house today, which is unusual.
Violation of corporate law.
I know, exactly. He is also, I have to say, the Senior Newmark Fellow of Cybersecurity Policy at Aspen Digital, and might have been the first director of CISA, as you all know, where he pioneered, relevant to this conversation, rumor control, which was designed to counter misinformation. Okay, so first let's take a quick look at the midterm. So, not so bad. Information integrity held up. Yasmin, I'm looking at you.
I think it's right, and I kind of don't like to represent big tech on the stage ever, but given that Jigsaw, it does sit inside one of the large technology companies, I won't go as far as to say that content moderation worked or was fully effective, but we do a lot of work over at Jigsaw on the ethnographic side. So we spend time with people doing research that kind of factors in everything to do with their lives and all of their internet usage, and then we kind of drill down from there. And so we have a panel of people who are very interested in conspiracies and disinformation. And so the interesting thing from our research was that election deniers really felt it. They felt the efficacy of platforms moderation. We heard from many of the people that we spoke to that too much of their stuff is being removed, and they had to leave the major platforms and go to alternatives. So Rumble, Parler, Truth Social, which is really good. I mean, the challenge is that there is an alternative ecosystem that is that's thriving, still not at the tipping point that it is of equal scale to the mainstream platforms. But the reason to be worried about those guys is that they explicitly don't have counter-misinformation policies. That's part of their shtick, is that they don't acknowledge that as part of their moderation. Effective to that point. The other one obviously was that right before the midterms, Elon Musk, kind of took over Twitter, and there was a lot of concern, not just about Twitter as a surface for the spread of election lies, but also that would spill over to other platforms that surface content from Twitter. So that was a big relief.
Well, we'll come back to Twitter, but that story is still playing out, as we know, minute to minute.
Check my phone.
So you feel like content moderation largely worked and pushed them to the edges where the conspiracy theorists are largely talking to each other. Yeah. Chris, so that's the private sector. What do you think the role of government, your former agency, and others was in?
Well, so 22, I think, was a lot like 20. And in fact, I felt there was a significant amount of validation and verification of that 2020 was, in fact, a safe and secure election, because we didn't really see anything, right? It was, as I said in 2020, or I'm sorry, a senior government official said, it was just another Tuesday on the internet. And it was fairly unremarkable. I think the biggest challenge the government had at all levels, so from federal down to local administration, was the mistakes that happen, or glitches, or errors, or whatever that happens in the administration. I mean, anytime you have technology, you have to price in some degree of just things going wrong, and that's why election administrators have adopted over the last several decades a concept known as software independence, where software hardware cannot be a single point of failure in the administration of elections. The greatest example of that was in Maricopa County on election day, where there was an error with the setting on on the printers, where the weight of the paper that was inserted in the machine, it was not calibrated properly, and so the printers couldn't heat up the paper to then put the ink on where it would set and be dark enough for the tabulators to read. So because it wasn't dark enough, you take the ballot, the voted ballot, you'd put it into the tabulator, and it would kick it back out because it wasn't, the markings, the timing marks on the side were not dark enough. Okay, so this completely took off in some of the disinformation and election denialist corners of the internet, saying, look, they're doing it again. Which is also, by the way, like entirely bereft of any logic, particularly when you have the ballot box, the drop box watchers that we saw early on in the election said, haha, we caught them last time, and they're so dumb they're going to go do the same thing with their ballot mules, and so we're going to watch them, we're going to catch them this time. So it never happened the first time, but they thought their strategy would be, hey, we'll catch them again doing this. So it didn't work. Anyway, back to the printers. So that then took off as, Maricopa County is trying to steal the election again. But the thing is, like I said, software independence, hardware, software, there are multiple different ways still to vote. You could drop it in the box, door 3. You could go to another vote center. It did not disrupt the actual ability to cast a vote. And that's the area that I think the electorate has been conditioned for, is that there will be something wrong. Anything that goes wrong should be immediately viewed with skepticism and suspicion as evidence of fraud, as evidence of a stolen election. Never mind the fact that over years and years of review, nothing has been verified because, frankly, nothing has happened behind the scenes. So, again, I think government did a good job, again, election administrators in administering the election. Security services did a good job keeping an eye out, interfering, or disrupting operations coming here, and then communicating. I think that's the key, is you can do all the stuff in the background, but you have to continue to communicate on what is happening and what the electorate, what the population should be thinking about as information is teed up and served to them.
And yet the conspiracy theorists have also in some ways been effective communicators. Rick, you have made the point when we were talking that the whole narrative around the notion of the steal has sort of just now become infused through the conversation.
Yeah, the narrative has changed from what it was in 2020, right?
Right.
In 2020, the narrative was stop the steal. This is something new that's happening. Right. We're in a position of power. We can stop this happening. We must react. We must rebel. We must do something about it. Whereas if you look at how it was being messaged this time around, it was actually expect the steal. It's become a foundational belief of that underlies any of the either deliberate disinformation or the received misinformation around election activities in the US, that the steal in and of itself is a reality. So we don't have to prove that to you anymore. What we have to do is we have to, G you up to take action based on this belief that we've already instilled in you. And to me, that's actually potentially more dangerous, because it means the groundwork is laid. And you've got to remember as well, I guess, that this is an in-between election. So when like the Carrie Lake thing happens, and then you see known, not bad actors, but known sort of bot accounts on Twitter, for example, are all tweeting in unison, do not concede, and then that's getting picked up by regular accounts of do not concede. You can fully expect that kind of inauthentic behavior to be magnified by orders of magnitude in 2 years' time. This is like just another practice run, right? But it's based on the fact that the narrative has changed.
So another disinformation or information disorder commission member, Kate Starbird, who's with the University of Washington, in the wake of the 2020 election, coined a phrase or a way to describe this activity of priming the pump and setting the expectation as participatory disinformation, where you have a set of elite influencers and then the base. And what the elites do is set the expectation that there is going to be some kind of shenanigans or hijinks. And so you're looking then, you're expecting it, and boom, that thing looks weird. I don't understand it. It's got to be evidence of a stolen election. So then it goes up to the influencers amplify, and it turns into this magnifying ecosystem of information that has only, to your point of, it's now set, it's calcified, it's all kind of metastasized around this concept, and so it was that much quicker of a trigger finger in 22, because last time they had to build up to it. And I still think with 2020 there was an element of A/B testing on the narratives that were working. And I think you're still seeing that now, but it was a lot of foreign interference at the beginning with Italian spy satellites, Spanish server farms, Chinese coming in through the thermostats. But technically that's kind of hard to grasp and grok. And moreover, like Lou Dobbs couldn't explain it, so it was never gonna really get that traction on the news outlets. And instead, they made that pivot in December to more domestic-oriented frames that actually resonated within a tribalist sort of sense of, oh, the Democrats always commit fraud. They always have the machine working and committing ballot trafficking or whatever they're calling it now. And then that moves forward to 22, right? They continue to improve. And I think you'll continue to see that sort of refinement of the messaging. Now, what was different this time around, though, with 22, in addition to being kind of the midterm, is that you didn't have the pinnacle. You have to have that voice at the top,
right?
The voice of God, that's really kind of pushing the message. Instead, it was really decentralized and distributed.
Isn't it God Emperor now?
Yeah.
Right, sorry, you're right. And that, I think, kind of undercut, for now.
Yeah.
For now.
Yeah. He's one of the, go
it's,
ahead.
For me, what you're saying underscores that clear difference between disinformation and misinformation, right? When something has been received and is simply repeated because people believe in it, that act of repeating, that's the misinformation part, right?
Which brings up a point for probably later discussion of, technically I think that's right, but I think those terms have lost all meaning in the current information environment.
And Yasmin, what tactics, so we're basically talking a little bit about sort of the psyops in a way, but what other tactics are you seeing at Jigsaw that you're tracking about the way these kind of influence operations have changed and evolved?
Well, just to build on the conversation so far, I think the fact that there wasn't a stop the steal this time removed some of that mobilization potential from, that you didn't have that existential, urgent, but you definitely have the mobilization capacity that's built up, to Chris's point, that if there were somebody at the pinnacle who were able to command that base to take action, it's definitely there. So we've had researchers attend a bunch of convenings of true believers over the last year, and there was one in October of a conference called The Great Reawakening. You can find out about it on I think it's like timetofreeamerica.com.
Don't.
And it's
don't find out.
But
don't navigate there.
The lineup is just, several years ago it would it sounds fantastical that you'd have like election denial and health like discredited medical health professionals and religious leaders, and they all have their own angle on the disinformation that they are peddling. And by the way, there was a ton of medical cures for sale, merch to rally the base, stickers, the t-shirts, banners, also coins like for protection against 5G, and just like anything you can imagine selling was like on, so this is a community that are there now for social connection, for capital T truth, and they are not going away, right? They have a lot of connection, of identity, of actual assembly. So what's interesting, I'd say in terms of looking forward, it is the intersectionality of all of the conspiracy beliefs and disinformation narrative, and then the fact that we will be seeing other platforms play a much more prominent role in the distribution and the mobilization of movements.
And it cuts to the quick as well, because the question, having spent a career in cybercrime related stuff, one of the questions that you always ask when it comes to online crime is, what's the motivation? Mm-hmm. Like, why will people carry out these activities? And one of the big ones is obviously monetization. Mm-hmm. How do I extract an income from these activities? And for disaster trolls, for disinformation operations, where conspiracy theorists, a lot of it is about monetizing the belief or the credulity of other people. And you see people selling merch, selling books, the coins that you speak of. In fact, that's where I got my tinfoil hat from.
Yeah.
Good job.
Right? Power, influence, and money.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of the nasty triad.
And boy, are there a lot of credulous people out there. It's just, it's astonishing.
Well, they told me it would work.
Yeah, and?
So just one kind of like thing I think that's worth pointing out, though, is I struggle sometimes with really understanding the reach of the community. How vibrant, is it growing, is it contracting, has it stopped? It's hard to measure, right? You can measure the activity online, but it's hard to measure the population itself. I will say this, the American voter stood up and said, we're done, at least for now. If you look at the statewide races, governor, secretary of state, and a handful of other ones, you saw that there was some kind of caloric deficit where we're just like, we're done. I can't deal with this chaos anymore. I think you saw that in the Senate, and I think you saw that in the House as well. But there has been some element of maybe the fever is starting to break a little bit. I'm not entirely confident that's a longer term prognostication, but something's different right now than it was, I think, a week and a half ago.
Okay, so that's in the United States. Let's turn our attention for a minute outside the United States, because we know there are some very significant elections coming up. In fact, Rick, you also talk about, make the good point that there are a lot of elections coming up in Africa where there's sort of a proxy war going on there for influence between the Chinese and the Russians.
Yep.
And other key elections around the world.
I mean, that's basically it. That we need to keep in mind that election interference is not something which is restricted to the US.
Right.
I mean, I was living in the UK, unfortunately, when they had the Brexit referendum. Yeah. I had been living outside the UK for over 4 years prior to that. When I came back, in all honesty, I didn't recognize the place. I didn't recognize the quality of discourse that people were having, or even the subjects that they were interested in. So insidious was the influence of disinformation over time, to the point where I left again, actually. I no longer live there. So it's not a phenomenon that's restricted to the US. So bearing that in mind, looking at what's happening between now and the next US presidential, where will people be trying to exert influence? What will that influence be? And how will they be honing their skills? Well, next year, in a swathe of African countries, there are general elections. And that's a resource-rich environment where countries like China and Russia are vying for influence. And within Europe, we have elections in Spain. We have, I'll count Turkey in there as well. Turkey has an election next year, which is hugely strategically important given geopolitical situation right now. And the country where I live right now, Poland, which is right on the border of the current conflict, we have an election there next year as well. And Russians in particular have form, obviously, in Poland, historical form, and they have expertise with those populations. Chinese less so, actually. Statistics and measurements say that Chinese propaganda has been significantly less successful in Poland, but we definitely need to watch for Russian interference in places other than here, not just because of the effect it has, but because of the fact that it does allow them to test and refine tactics and techniques.
I mean, look, the global south is a huge blind spot, I think, not necessarily in the elements of the research community, but I think more broadly, particularly at the platforms, the ability to invest in these different regions. I mean, you look at, in part, what's happening at Twitter, for example, and some of the eradication of staff that focus on non-monetizable markets, and they're just cleaning house and also reducing the service. So I think this is a huge area going forward, but also I kind of the point you make about Russia's success versus China's success. I mean, right, the tactics are different, the outcomes are different, and what worries me is the longer term implication of the Chinese Communist Party improvement of their techniques. They're still quite rudimentary, but they are starting to kind of follow this Russification model that's more overt, that's more engaging online. And if you combine that with some of their historical corruption techniques, I mean, just the report last week out of Canada on some of the influence operations of members of the parliament, I guess, there have been aspects of that here in the United States at local levels, at community level.
Just briefly, what is it that happened, just for people that don't know, in Canada?
Chinese intelligence services, essentially corrupting officials, government officials, to align with policy positions. I mean, so this is the great Rob Joyce quote from the RSA conference in 2019. Russia's the hurricane and China's climate change. It's really how you have to think about the way they've operationalized their information operations. So I think for sure right now in Europe, Russia is active. They have always been active since the beginning of the modern era. But China is absolutely investing, and they will look, by the way, as there is whatever happens in the escalation between China and Taiwan, they will look to split the EU. They will look to split NATO. It takes one member in the EU, right, to break the unanimous. That's not going to be hard. They peel one off. That's their game plan. That's how they can do it. They can invest in those capabilities. This is part of the Belt and Road strategy as well, of debt traps and other investment techniques. So I think it's the longer term play. It's much more insidious. It's much harder to play defense against because of the scale of it.
And that's another election, 2024, Taiwan.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
So that's it's not a one and done event, and it's something which is continuously refined and honed and has unforeseen outcomes.
Right.
Yasmin, you've been doing a lot of work at Jigsaw. You've been running these large-scale experiments around pre-bunking that have been effective. So talk to us a little bit about that. That's been in Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah. It connects to the conversation we're just having, because when you think about, misinformation is the language around this whole challenge is not helpful. With a word like misinformation, when I say it, you may have assumptions about what I believe to be misinformation versus somebody who is has the same political or ideological beliefs as you, or opposite ones, etc. But when you look at the types of misinformation that are the most harmful, which are the ones that we should and do prioritize addressing, they do tend to have some common attributes. And one of those attributes is scapegoating and fear-mongering. And in a polarized society, which this is one, but the UK, this happened around Brexit, and I think is the most dangerous type of misinformation to really have purchase in a country, is where minority groups, or underrepresented groups, or any group that is not the one with the one that's represented by the elite, when they are presented as a security threat, or otherwise a threat to your well-being or safety, then the stakes are really, really high. So in the US, if Stop the Steal really does lose its gloss, then what we can expect is that victimhood mentality around your election was stolen and the vote was stolen will shift to a victimhood around something else. One likely candidate is, immigrants and other, and if not taking your jobs, then posing a threat to you. And that's, was actually the concern that we had in Central and Eastern Europe following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We were interested in thinking about the likely disinformation tropes that were going to take hold. And we kind of consulted broadly, and one of the ones was around refugees. So, Rick is more expert and actually has lived experience of this particular topic, but in Poland they opened the borders to Ukrainian refugees after the war. You yourself took in 3 families, right? It wasn't a government, the government said they can come in and they can have free schooling and free transport and free healthcare, but didn't expand the infrastructure at all to make that happen. It was just dependent on people to, the generosity of the country became an NGO. But it's obvious what happens if you don't, if there is no expansion of infrastructure, and eventually, the new waves of refugees may not have the same amount of resources as the first ones because they didn't have the instinct to leave immediately. They don't have a place to go next. They may not be able to work or command the same livelihood. So there was obviously going to be a challenge we anticipated with sentiment towards refugees, and looking at how the Kremlin in particular had been so effective in the case of the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe of really stoking fear and undermining European leaders based on the fact that they had let these Syrians in. We decided that we were going to try to get ahead of that disinformation using a tool called pre-bunking. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term. You certainly are familiar with the term debunking, I guess, which is about trying to correct a false claim after the fact. Pre-bunking is about trying to precede the bunk. And so the question is, how do you get ahead of a narrative that hasn't happened, that hasn't taken hold yet? And it's because actually when it comes to disinformation, and especially in the categories that we care most about, it's the same tropes that are, it's like, just like you think about the movies that your favorite, whether it's like Star Wars or Romeo and Juliet, or there's actually only so many storylines and they're repeated. And the same is true with if, during the development of the COVID vaccine, any expert in the anti-vax movement could have told you and did tell you if you asked them, it was going to be my body, my choice, big pharma, vaccine injury. It's just the same things. Same with, but we do a lot of work on radicalization, and we speak to a lot of people who have been part of violent white supremacist groups, and there are very many different types of violent white supremacist groups, but all of them on the on-ramp have the pseudoscience of race. It's just, they depend on these tropes, and on one hand it can feel a bit like, this is just happening to us, like these tropes again and again on elections, on health, and there's no recourse for us, but actually it's the predictability of the misinformation that can be its undoing. Because if you can anticipate it, then you can mitigate it. And Chris is nodding because he kind of was like the first to deploy this in one of the many firsts of his inaugural CISA administration was trying to arm people to make them resilient to manipulation. And so in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, we've just launched a big video campaign that aims to pre-bunk refugee hate and misinformation. Pre-bunking has 3 components. One is an alert that there's going to be an attempt to manipulate you. We don't like that. That gets our shields up. The second is to microdose you with the misinformation, and the third is to emphatically... The second is what? To microdose you. So what is it? What is the narrative you're going to hear about Ukrainian refugees? And in this case, that that you're not safe, or they've, in Poland, they're going to take, there's no apartments available for normal Poles because the Ukrainians have taken them all. And then to explain why that's false and why it is true that you are the subject of an attack to manipulate you. So that preceding part is really important. It's very different like after you've walked through like a rough neighborhood for me to tell you that was a rough neighborhood. It's much more effective for me to tell you before. So the preceding is really important. And one of the benefits that has is it separates the speech from the speaker. I feel like a lot of the time, a lot of the challenge that major platforms have is that, if like the president is the person who's saying, making a false claim, and you want to, and then you want to show up and fact check the president, there's a lot of extra baggage and equities involved in that outside of just the underlying claim.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
That happens.
That explains it.
We've done a bunch of research with academics and a bunch of in American University and Bristol and Cambridge, showing the efficacy of this across different, efficacy in terms of people's ability to spot the manipulation attempt that's being tried on them, efficacy in terms of how much they report trusting the source or their willingness to spread it. I would just say that it's one example of what it looks like to go on the offense with tackling disinformation.
And it's something we've seen actually quite a lot in the military campaign in Ukraine, like pre-bunking of Russian disinformation about things that they may or may not do.
That's a great example. So the Russian
have been saying up front, hey, the Russians are going to say this. Or they're going to do this.
They're going to say that the Ukrainians attacked so they can retaliate. But it's a great example.
And there was some, probably some underlying exquisite intelligence, but nonetheless, on the point about like CISA and rumor control, we didn't necessarily originate that, right? We stole that shamelessly from FEMA. You mentioned the disaster trolls that come in after hurricanes and say, you're going to get public assistance. This is how you register for it. They take your personal information. They apply. They get the money. So we just did it better, right? That's the difference. But the key here is that the pre-bunking is dependent upon identifying the areas of risk, the potential areas that could be exploited. We spent 2.5 to 3 years scenario building. But here's the thing, to your point of tropes, we probably had 20, 30 different scenarios where someone could exploit or claim something went wrong. Once you get past 10, they all look the same, or at least the response is 85% similar across.
It has to be the level of
ensuing
narratives. It can't be individual claims because there are too many and you can't anticipate them. Actually, the origin of the social psychology and the theory around pre-bunking was actually during the Cold War, when Americans would be captured, the military members would be captured in Korea, and as prisoners of war, they'd be brainwashed. And they'd go in thinking that they're for the Americans, and then they'd switch sides. And so the American military decided that they need to send troops abroad in Vietnam with mental armor as well as physical armor. So it's been around for quite some time.
Oddly enough, and I'm sure there's some additional threat researchers out there that know how the Russians work, when they talk about information operations, it's split into technical operations, so on-network type activity, and then psychological operations, which is trying to get the human response. And so a lot of what I think we're worried about right now from an information operation perspective of Russia, perhaps expanding cyber operations outside of Ukraine, is that they could go after critical national infrastructure and just make something wobble enough to create panic in society. And that is part of it. It's not about necessarily fully disrupting the technical infrastructure or the infrastructure delivery. It's about creating havoc and panic. Just think about in the wake of Colonial Pipeline, right? So that was out. I live in DC, couldn't get gas for about 4 or 5 days. But when you saw the reactions throughout the Southeast, people literally filling up, garbage bags with gasoline. People in the state of Florida that are not serviced by a Colonial Pipeline. They have barges come in. And don't make a Florida joke. You were about to. But nonetheless, it shows you the power of the tropes, of the narratives, and the things that happen.
It's psychological pre-positioning in conjunction with actions on objectives, right? Those two things working together. Do the pre-positioning, lay the groundwork, make something that looks a little bit sketchy happen. And you've already laid the groundwork for panic to occur as a result of that.
Okay, so we've segued our conversation seamlessly with this conversation about what we can do to fortify ourselves, fortify the public around future elections and misinformation. We talk about pre-bunking. Rick, you talk a little bit about, you're particularly interested in regulatory mechanisms and the DSA. So what do you think needs to happen there?
Yeah, so the timing is perfect because actually the EU Digital Services Act has been officially adopted today, the DSA.
That's why we planned the summit.
You did perfect. You did a perfect job. It actually, I wrote the date down so I could get it exactly right. It enters into force on the 17th of February 24. That's when it will actually be fully in force. But the timelines start now for making preparations. So the first thing that will happen is platforms and search engines will have to report their user count. And that allows them to be segregated into whether they count as very large publishers or very large search engines or smaller ones. And the exigencies on them are different according to that. And obviously the exigencies are higher on the very large ones. And it's things like it outright bans, which I think is way overdue, because they get me all the time. It outright bans dark patterns. And if you're not familiar with what dark patterns are, they're basically website design strategies to make you do the wrong thing. You know, with the cookie pop-up boxes or the granting permission to access your stuff or follow you around the web, that you will always notice that the button that you don't want to click is the one that's highlighted in the brightest color to try and get you to click it. That's dark patterns. So the DSA outlaws those, for example. Whatever website you're designing, no more of that. But it also places obligations on organizations for co-regulatory activities. There's a lot of the DSA that would not pass in the US a First Amendment sniff test. It just wouldn't be acceptable. But the co-regulatory aspect of it, I think, is something that could be and should be widely adopted here, where government and industry work together, where there are annual assessments and also mitigations are worked on with government oversight, where industry participates in the writing of codes of conduct with government oversight that they will then adhere to, where there are independent annual audits of compliance with codes of conduct and results of assessments. And one of the most important things for me, germane to this conversation, is that the DSA mandates multi-stakeholder consultation where there may be systemic risk across interested parties, for example, social networks, let's say. So it obligates the Twitters and Facebooks of the world to work together to identify systemic risk and to do something about it. Yeah. And the cool thing, which we saw with GDPR, is that when legislation and regulation is so wide-ranging, it does have knock-on effects outside of the EU because it's aimed at anyone who makes their services available in the EU. And it's easier, it's least friction for a company like Facebook to have a global policy rather than do something different in the EU to the rest of the world. So it's a positive.
So, Chris, solutions. I've heard you talk a lot about transparency, sort of really the election administration, which you pioneered about it, really opening it up, sort of an open book on all of the challenges that.
So a couple things here. First, leaders have to lead. We have to get out of this mindset of, what's the harm in humoring him for a little bit and going on? No, it's unacceptable. We have to have more officials stand up. There have been a handful of GOP members, Dan Crenshaw is one example, that said, no, this is all garbage. The election wasn't stolen. We just didn't deliver solutions for the voters. So leaders have to lead. The second is continued investment in election infrastructure to take away any of the riskier bits. And that's the touch screens that store the vote down on removable media, the DRE equipment that's Louisiana and Texas, Indiana, Tennessee, and a few others. Risk-based investment, get rid of them, and then supplement on top with post-election pre-certification audits. I think the third thing is continue to invest in election officials in their ability to communicate. 4 years ago, they were completely out of the spotlight. Now they're the spotlight, and they need help in strategic messaging communication. Stephen Richer in Maricopa County has really been great at being an open book and talking about how elections work. And then fourth and finally, civics education. That was one of our recommendations in the Information Disorder Report. That was one of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommendations. There's a piece of legislation on the Senate, Senators Coons and Cornyn, that if we can get that through, I think it'll be a great starting investment. And I'm not talking about educating us on civics, but it's our kids, because that's where you can really influence it the greatest effect.
I will add a fifth as we go to the floor for, unfortunately, one question, which is journalism. More local news, more sustainable local news. Fill those news deserts. We have time for one question. Can we see? I can't see anything. So
There's one right there.
if the mic runners, okay,
see
here we go,
two.
right here, okay.
That's the guy that I put in the audience, by the way.
There we go.
Thank you. My question would be kind of on expanding education in civics, and I do a lot of work, a student at Boston University, do a lot of research into political literacy, and one of the biggest challenges that I'm finding in interviewing people is it's really difficult sometimes to have conversations with people and have them not feel condescended to or talked down to when it comes to, especially people in the southern part of the United States that really, truly, unfortunately, fell victim to a lot of misinformation in the campaign. So my question to all of you, and this is not just the US, on a wider scale, is how do we begin to have those conversations and debunk and pre-bunk without making people feel talked down to or condescended to?
We have only 1 minute to answer that question. So, Chris, you're closest to the South in the United States.
I'm born and raised in Atlanta. My parents are both from Alabama, so I'm pretty familiar with this. I suck at this because it requires a ton of empathy, and I have zero empathy right now. I have none. Like, I'm still struggling with PTSD from 2020, so I'm not the most empathetic person. But look, I mean, that's part of it. You got to meet them where they are, understand that they may be operating from a different experience base than you, and educate. But you also have to recognize you're not going to reach everybody. And that was kind of one of our keys with rumor control, was not, the people that were already in the fever swamp, we were not going to get to them. We wanted to get the people that were on the fence and hopefully wouldn't fall in.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm afraid, thank you, that's a great question, but that's all the time we have. So, Chris, Yasmin, Rick, thank you so much, and off we go.